Hello, Ask3CIA team. It's Ben Habib here from the International Relations Program, and it's wonderful to be part of the Critical Issues in Contemporary Asia lecture program this semester. And I'm here to talk about tourism in North Korea. So tourism is a great entry point to learning more about the DPRK because it intersects with all of the big issues like diplomacy, security and economy, as well as the structure of North Korean politics and government. It interacts with all of these things in one way or another, and it compels us to weigh up the significant ethical questions that arise from engagement with an authoritarian regime. I'm a North Korea specialist by trade. I've been to North Korea 3 times, as well as numerous visits to South Korea and to China in Liaoning and Jilin provinces along the China-North Korea frontier. So what I'm presenting here is as much an experiential travel memoir as it is an academic monologue. So I hope you find this interesting and enjoy. Now, as well as my own expertise and experience, I'm going to draw on the observations of 2 other experts who were with me during my travels. And that's Dr. Dean Ouellette, who's from the Institute of Far Eastern Studies in Seoul. And you've met Dean as the author of one of the readings this week. And also Dr. Emma Campbell, who was formerly of Australian National University. Both of them outstanding academics and intellectuals who've contributed great work to the field. Their writing is both reflective of my experience as well, because I was there with them, but they also have their own unique perspective on the immersive experiences that we had in country. So between the 3 of us, there's a really interesting interplay in how we interpreted the experience of being on tour in the DPRK. So to briefly outline what I'm going to cover in the video, first I'll talk about what it's like to visit North Korea. Then I'll examine the economic and political significance of tourism in North Korea. And I'll examine the significance of tourism for social change processes in the DPRK, which I think is a really important point that we need to engage with, particularly when we think about the ethical questions that arise from visiting North Korea. And then finally, I'll end up talking about my field research in North Korea and the specific observational methodology I use to gather data while I'm in country. And keep that methodology in mind because we're going to play around with that during the activity portion of the seminar. It's not easy, nor is it cheap to go to North Korea. So why do people go there? Well, there's a number of different reasons. Some people go for business, as traders or as foreign investors in joint venture projects. There's also development professionals from NGOs or from UN agencies who are working on aid and capacity building projects. There's the quirky travel crowd, if you like. So this is typically Westerners who like to collect countries and go places that are off the beaten track, off the more popular tourist trails. No Westerners would go to North Korea for a holiday per se. It's not that kind of destination. However, there are a lot of Chinese tourists who go there on short trips because it's close by and it's cheap for them. And they go there for gambling or shopping and just for a short period away. And there's many more Chinese visitors that go to North Korea than from anywhere else. I think it's much easier for Chinese people to go there than for other foreigners because of proximity, because of entry rules, and because of different pricing for them. And then there's also people like me. So there's academics and think tank types who are there researching North Korea and want to learn more about the country for professional reasons. But there's also people who can't enter the DPRK. So for one, South Korean citizens are not allowed in unless they're part of an official government delegation. Journalists are not allowed in unless they're specifically invited. But at present, virtually no one is allowed in because of the COVID pandemic and the border restrictions. North Korea is not a place where you can just cruise around independently. It's not a backpacking country by any means. So you have to go on an organised tour that's run by the state-run tour agency, and then they interact with different tour companies from outside North Korea. Now, the tour guides that take you on your tour, they're very knowledgeable and they're very friendly. They've got lots of experience interacting with foreigners. But they're also intelligence agents. So they're gathering data on the tour groups and they report back regularly to their handlers. So that's something they do at night time once all the tour guests go to sleep. Now, my 2012 trip, for example, this was a particularly sensitive group of high-profile academics and journalists So in these photos here, you see the cameraman in the blue shirt who was filming everything. Now, we did get to buy the DVD at the end of the trip from all of this film footage, but it was really there to take footage for surveillance purposes. So that film was going up the chain into the intelligence agencies because it was such a sensitive group. It's not common for other tour groups to be filmed in that way. There's also a lot of people in the general area around the tour groups. And these are people, they look like civilians, they look like they're just doing their own thing, but you do notice they're keeping an eye on you. And if you happen to stray too far from the tour pack, they will firmly but nicely encourage you to head back in the direction of the group. It's pretty rare to have an actual organic interaction with ordinary people. They're either kept away from the tour groups, or they deliberately keep themselves at a distance because they're not cleared to interact with foreigners. So if I tried to talk to someone on the street who's just an ordinary person, I could get them in trouble because they haven't been cleared politically to be able to talk to me. So that's a responsibility that I have as a visitor, not to put people in that position. All electronic devices are taken from you at border crossings when you enter and exit the country, and they're doing that to check for banned materials. So they'll literally go through every photo in your phone or camera and delete any that they deem are too sensitive. And of course, if they find something that's really sensitive material, then you might be arrested or detained for a little while. Taking books in with you, that's pretty fraught. I never did that. I mean, you can do it, but they're checking for anything of political sensitivity. And you don't know what kind of material is going to set them off. And anything linked to politics or Christianity is a definite no-no. So you don't take anything like that in as well. I mean, this is when you enter a very reasonably closed authoritarian country that maintains information controls. This is the nuts and bolts of how they do it when you enter in and out of the country. There is a well-worn itinerary that visitors to North Korea follow, regardless of which tour company you end up travelling with. So when you see people's video memoirs from North Korea and they claim that they're peering inside the Hermit Kingdom, with never-before-seen footage, that's bullshit. They're showing footage from the same locations that everyone else goes to, and it's a very well-beaten track. The tourist infrastructure in Pyongyang is pretty good. But once you go outside of the capital, it's a different experience, as many of the hotels outside Pyongyang are only open when a tourist group comes through, and that's not every day. It might even be once or twice a week. So you're going into a hotel, it's kind of devoid of life. It feels like you're squatting in there, because it doesn't feel like it's actually open, because it's only catering to you. When you're travelling around outside of the cities, usually you're on very bumpy dirt roads. And I mean really bumpy. When you're travelling around in a bus, boom, boom, you're bouncing around and it's a very uncomfortable ride. Now, the main highway network, there's a main north-south highway from Kaesong through Pyongyang, all the way almost up to the China border, and there's an east-west highway from Pyongyang that goes all the way to Wonsan. Now, these are paved roads and they're very wide, and they're like that for strategic reasons, to accommodate heavy artillery pieces and to act as runways for aircraft in the event of war. But there's not that many cars, not that many people own cars in North Korea. So you've got these big wide roads with no one on them. But by and large, most of the roads around the countryside are dirt roads. And of course, when it rains in the wet summers, they become really boggy and sometimes impassable. You have to bring money into the country with you. There's no ATMs, and the banks certainly are not set up to service foreigners. So you have to pay for everything in Chinese yuan, American dollar or euros, and you have to bring all of that with you in before you come. You can't get any more while you're there. Cell phones are now permitted, although when I went there, they weren't. That's a more newer innovation. So you can call out from there now. I should note there have been some improvements since I was in North Korea in 2013. So as Dean Ouellette notes in his reading, tourism development has been a big focus of Kim Jong-un's economic regeneration strategy. So the tourist infrastructure has improved, but that's been really piecemeal, and it's still not up to the standard of more popular tourist destinations around the world. As tourists, you are well taken care of while you're on the trip. So as you can see here from these photos, you dine like kings. The food is excellent, but there is a lot of guilt that comes with this fine dining. When you know that the country has endured a great famine in recent memory and that the country is in permanent food insecurity. There's a lot we can learn about North Korea from its tourism industry. Coming back to Dean Ouellette's reading again, Kim Jong-un has signalled the tourism sector development in a number of his key speeches. He's emphasised facility and manpower development. He's talked about the designation of new special economic zones with tourism precincts. And he's talked about developing a new approach towards foreigners in the country that's not quite so hostile. So this has been part of Kim's broader theme of prioritising economic development and higher living standards, of delivering a strong and prosperous country, as the official slogan went. But even though North Korea is a dictatorship, maintaining internal support is still important to the longevity of this system. It's still important to the perpetuation of the Kim regime. So if Kim Jong-un can deliver on making North Korea a strong and prosperous country, so if he can deliver on that rhetoric, or at least provide the pretense of doing it, it strengthens his support among the people and among the country's elite. And that's the really important support base among the elite. And that can help to keep his grip on power tight. So he can point to things like new recreational facilities, like those pictured in Pyongyang here, as evidence of this new prosperity. It's visual evidence that this strong and prosperous country promise is taking shape. But there's a link here to the nuclear weapons program as well. The North Korean government sees the nuclear umbrella as the security guarantee under which this economic regeneration can take place, while also maintaining the integrity of North Korea's political system and the Kim regime. So tourism is an important part of that regeneration vision. Further to this economic significance, North Korea's economy has never really recovered from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the consequent loss of the communist bloc as a trade partner. After this, its economy was decimated through the 1990s with the associated Great Famine. Since 2006, in its first nuclear weapons test, the economy has been slowly strangled by increasingly harsh economic sanctions that the international community has placed on North Korea in response to its nuclear weapons program. So the economic system, there's a lot of constraints there. So tourism ends up making a more important contribution to the economic picture than you might first think when you think of tourism as a sector in other economies around the world. There isn't much that North Korea produces that the world actually wants. It doesn't produce anything that would generate foreign currency income for the government. So the regime tries to jump on anything that might make it some money. And tourism is one way that the government can bring foreign currency into North Korea without violating UN sanctions. So in particular, Chinese yuan, US dollars and euros, they're the currencies of choice. And as I said earlier, tourists can only buy things in North Korea with those currencies. They don't get access to the North Korean won. Tourism's importance to national economic development is also reflected in Kim's designation of numerous new special economic zones. So special economic zones are becoming vehicles for North Korea's broader economic modernisation. So these SEZs, these are kind of small enclaves in important areas, particularly around the border regions with China and also near South Korea, that can become hubs for foreign direct investment. So this is where the action is in terms of economic production now and the economic modernisation drive. And this is also why there's a crossover between business tourism and leisure tourism in these locations. SEZs are where the best tourist infrastructure is being developed in specially designated international tourism zones. But it's not just about the money. There's a heavy ideological undercurrent that permeates the tour experience to North Korea. So the itinerary of tours to the DPRK are heavily filled with visits to sites of ideological significance to the Kim regime. So for example, every city and town has its monuments to the leaders and its revolutionary museums, which contain artifacts from the times that the leaders have visited those areas. So it's heavily invested with this personality cult around the leaders. If we look at Pyongyang itself, this city is so loaded with monuments and revolutionary architecture that you could call it an ideological theme park. All of this stuff is designed to project power and to emphasize the personality cult of the Kims. So the obvious critique then is that on the tour you're not seeing the real North Korea. And that's true. The tour experience in North Korea is heavily manicured to show North Korea's best face. Some people have argued that what you see is essentially something called a Potemkin village. Now, a Potemkin village, this is not a term that's come from North Korea studies, but it's highly applicable here. So a Potemkin village is a construction from a building facade to entire towns that are built for the purpose of deceiving visitors into believing that the local situation is better than it really is. So the name itself comes from Russian Field Marshal Prince Gregory Potemkin, back in the late 18th century. So in 1787, he arranged for the construction of entire fake villages in the Crimea when his boss, the Empress Catherine the Great, was coming to visit. So he wanted to hide the grim reality that was occurring in these recently conquered areas of the Crimea region. So this is actually a very common behavioural characteristic within authoritarian hierarchies, where sort of high-level functionaries just below the leader try to shield the leaders from information that's going to upset them. And this is certainly not a behaviour that's confined to either North Korea or to authoritarian states per se. You also see this behaviour in any hierarchical organisational structure, companies, government departments, etc. Now, there's no doubt that the North Korean government attempts to present a particular narrative about the country and a particular narrative about its people to the tourists who visit the country. And this isn't unusual in itself. If you go on a tour to any country, they're going to show you the best of the places that they visit, and they're going to make choices about what's best. So there's always some kind of message or worldview that's encoded into the tour experience about what the hosts think is most important about that country and its national narrative. But there is a line, though, between presenting your best face and outright fabrication, and that line is often blurred in the North Korean case. So, for example, if we look in the big picture below, the Kijongdong village next to the DMZ, this has the world's biggest flagpole, which was built to be larger than a similar flagpole that's on the South Korean side. So very much a flag measuring contest went on here. And all the buildings you see there, these are hollow concrete apartment buildings. They don't have any glass or anything in them. So they're attempting to present a facade of prosperity here. This is very much a Potemkin village. So everything about the tour itinerary is coded messaging. Take another example here of some religious sites that are on the itineraries, like this Buddhist shrine, which is in the mountains outside of Chongjin, or the church mass that I photographed in the top right here. So in these places, you're given the impression that these are actually functioning religious and spiritual centres. However, it's well documented that North Korea engages in high-level religious persecution, and particularly of Christianity. And that's because religion is seen as a potential rallying force for collective organisation. So that could become a rallying force against the government, which is why the government's against it, because the only rallying force the government wants is the leader, the Kims. The Kims are the quasi-religion of North Korea. So with that in mind, what we're seeing at these religious sites on the tour is very likely more Potemkin village facades, designed to project to foreigners that the North Korean government respects human rights. So it's a direct response of this international critique at religious persecution. Because why else would they be on the tour itinerary? In the general scheme of things, these are not important sites in North Korea. Like, you wouldn't go visit these places on a tour, given everything else that you could go and see in the country. Tourism is also part of a broader story about social change in North Korea. So there's been quite a dynamic process of social change that's been happening in North Korea since the turn of the century, and it's gathered pace over the last 10 years. As the economy has become more marketised, there's a small but growing middle class that's emerged. So these are people with income sources and disposable income of their own, which they can spend on consumable goods and make lifestyle choices that would be unheard of for people in North Korea 20 years ago. So this class of people is known as the Tunju. The emerging tourism sector is both a leisure option and a revenue source for the entrepreneurs within the Tunju class. The rise of the Tunju also shows that the political relationship between the people and the state has altered quite a bit since the famine. And that's because the shape of the economy has changed. So the political and social relationships that emerge from the shape of the economy as a result of the economy changing. There's debates about the impact of foreigners being in proximity to North Korean people and what people-to-people interactions might mean for these social change processes. So if we look to Ju Sung-ha, who's a journalist for the Donga Ilbo in South Korea, and Ju's also a North Korean exile. Ju said that North Koreans pick up a lot from tourists and that tourism might help them realise how under Kim Jong-un they're behind the rest of the world from both political and economic perspectives. And that's a good point. But they probably already know this. You know, North Korea is not the closed box that it might have been 30 or 40 years ago. The North Korean people have access to South Korean media. They know what's going on in the outside world. They know where North Korea sits in relation to the countries around it. What they don't have is the knowledge or capacity for political action and mobilisation. So understanding your relative position is one thing, being able to do something about it is another. In the photos here on left, you see me with the lady who hosted me on a one-night homestay. So I stayed up that night drinking soju and talking with her and her husband, and it was an amazing experience, one of the best experiences I've had in North Korea. In the picture below that, you see Emma Campbell, who I mentioned earlier. She's dancing and singing at a restaurant, and there's lots of other people around who are watching this as well, not just our tour group. So what these illustrate is that it puts a face on the foreign devils. Even if the people that tourists interact with are hand-selected for their loyalty to the regime, or even if tourists are only seen at a distance, your very presence there still creates a contrast with the clumsy caricatures of evil imperialists that are seen in official propaganda. So contrast us on the left with the images of American GIs on the right, which is how most foreigners from the West are depicted in official materials. So people-to-people interaction doesn't guarantee changing attitudes about foreigners, but it is the prerequisite for that change to take place. Travelling to North Korea is quite expensive, even when considering that you are paying for an all-expenses-paid tour. Clearly, there's some profit skimming in the price where the North Korean government takes some money off the top of that. So with that in mind, the most common ethical critique of tourism to the DPRK is that tourism helps to finance the Kim regime and particularly helps to finance the regime's human rights abuses and nuclear weapons proliferation. And this is a pretty biting critique. It's hard to deny that any revenue stream that the North Korean government has will finance government spending, some of which is funneled into the military for these purposes. And as it's argued in the literature, a very disproportionate amount of government income is funneled into military purposes at the expense of the people. A common counter-argument to that is that being on the ground is important to helping the outside world understand North Korea better, and that people-to-people engagement can help to take some of the heat out of interstate rivalry. A more sophisticated version of this argument, and one that I personally subscribe to, is that cross-border flows of people and money and ideas undermine authoritarian control mechanisms and help to reshape the socio-economic relationship between the North Korean people and the state. And as a result, over time, reshaping the politics of the country as well. But there's a different argument from that, a counter-argument to the financing the regime thing. And that's that all governments skim money from travellers through visas and border regulations. Australian government certainly does that. Given that all governments engage in one form or another of nefarious activities, does that mean that any international travel inevitably funds the war-making and coercive abuses of governments? So if I was to travel to the United States, does that mean that I'm financing drone strikes that kill civilians in the Middle East? If a British backpacker travels to Australia, does that mean that they're financing offshore immigration detention camps? Well, this depends on how myopic you want to be about the relative evil of different governments. And it highlights how nationalistic and how partisan the analysis of North Korea can be, as if the DPRK exists in a separate universe to the rest of international relations. But there is definitely a moral relativism trap here that IR analysts would do well to avoid. Nevertheless, tourism funding the regime is a difficult ethical question. And that discomfort is not something that we should dismiss. We need to be able to sit with it because it's an important ethical question. For anyone who's concerned about human rights and concerned about the well-being of the North Korean people, this ultimately comes down to a question of how quickly change can be made and what kind of risks you're willing to accept in order for that change to happen. So if you don't want to risk war and the consequences of that for the region and for the North Korean people, then how do you go about improving the human rights situation? Maybe trying to turbocharge social change dynamics through cross-border interactions is one possible pathway to that systemic transformation. Another ethical dilemma is how your presence as a tourist can be exploited to legitimise the government. So the photo you see here, this is not one of mine, but our tour group did something similar on many occasions. This is the standard ritual that happens every time you visit a monument to the leaders on the tour itinerary. So you stand in line, someone lays a wreath of flowers at the foot of the statues. You can see the flowers there on this statue. And then everyone bows. And usually there's photos taken of all of the foreigners bowing to the Kim statues. Now, the tour guides explain that this is the customary mark of respect when you attend one of these monuments, and you do it because you want to be a gracious guest. However, because these events are photographed, they can be used for publication in North Korean official media, and the way they're explained to locals in those reports is that the foreigners are coming to North Korea to pay homage to the Kims, which is certainly not at all what we're doing there. So inadvertently, you become a pawn in domestic propaganda. Travelling in North Korea is generally extremely safe. One of the flip sides of being under such close surveillance also means that you're not going to get mugged or assaulted or any of those kind of crimes. The external tour operators that facilitate your tours into the country, they give you very clear briefings about what is and what isn't okay before you enter North Korea. So for both of my 2013 and 2012 trips, we did full-day workshops prior to departure, outlining all the do's and don'ts. So if you follow those rules, you're fine, you're not in any danger. However, if you cross those lines, then you're at the mercy of the North Korean security apparatus. Now, it's a running joke in North Korea watcher circles that the DPRK government believes that Westerners who come to North Korea necessarily have an agenda. They're either secretly spies or political agitators, or they're Christian missionaries looking to proselytize. So if you break the clearly defined red lines for tourists, those assumptions kick in. They think that you're one of those things. Let's look at some examples. Take the case of the US college student Otto Warmbier, who was detained after stealing a poster from the Yanggakdo Hotel in Pyongyang. So I stayed at a hotel. I know the stuff that he took. He was in a tour group, they got drunk and did something stupid, and he paid a really big price for that. So you can see he's pictured here at the press conference that was held after his arrest, and clearly he's in great distress. You can imagine what this experience would have been like. Now, unfortunately, he was eventually returned to the US in a vegetative state, in a coma, for which there was no final explanation given, and he died soon after his return to the US. Another case is that of Alex Sigley, who was the young Australian entrepreneur who lived as a student in Pyongyang for some time and also led a number of tour groups into the country. Indeed, some previous Pol 2 CPA students of mine travelled with him a few years back. Now, Sigley was detained because he'd made regular blog postings just about everyday life in Pyongyang. Now, these were really innocuous. He was talking about food or daily activities. There was nothing remotely political about it. But the security apparatus deemed that his blog was too politically sensitive, particularly at the time he was writing, which was around the summit processes back in 2019. So he was seen as a political liability. He was arrested. He was held for a bit over a week, I think, and eventually he returned to Australia. Then there's a different case, and that's the case of Michael Spavor. Now, Michael Spavor led study tours and educational exchanges to North Korea from his base in China, including the 2013 trip that Dean Ouellette, Emma Campbell and I were on. So I know Michael, and he became high profile a little bit after that when he facilitated the visits to North Korea of former NBA star Dennis Rodman and the Harlem Globetrotters basketball team to North Korea to meet Kim Jong-un. So you can see one of those trips pictured on the bottom right here. Now, Michael became a victim of hostage diplomacy, but this time with China. So he was imprisoned 2 years ago as one of 2 Canadians that were arrested in retaliation for the detention in Canada of Meng Wanzhou, who was the Huawei North America CEO, who was arrested on charges of bank fraud. So Spavor has since been charged with espionage by the Chinese government and is unlikely to be released unless Meng is also released, which is also unlikely. So this is a horrible situation that Michael's been caught up in. But there's been numerous other cases as well. The Kenneth Bay case comes to mind. But what all of these cases highlight are the dangers of becoming pawns in great power games of hostage diplomacy. And that's the reality of when you want to travel to a country it's in such a politically charged environment, both internally and in terms of great power politics, that is a risk that you can run. I want to briefly touch on the field research element of travel to North Korea, because this is really important for academic study of the country and how we know what we know about what's going on there. So traditional research methods like interviews and surveys, these are virtually impossible if you go to North Korea. There's the problem of surveillance, so you're constantly monitored and you're obstructed by your guides if you want to do anything that's outside of the itinerary. That's just not on. There's the problem of getting access to people in the first place. So this is very difficult unless you have direct connections to high levels of government. And even then, it's an extraordinarily complex exercise to be able to get access to the people you want to speak to. Just ask anyone that works for the UN agencies that work in country. There's the problem of putting your interviewees at risk. So they have no incentive to talk to you. It's not in their interest. They could get in trouble if they tell you anything that's considered sensitive. And then there's the problem of interviewees just spouting the party line. So even if they do talk to you, they're not going to tell you anything that you can't find reading KCNA or Nodong Shinmun. It's just the party line. Now, these are problems. They're not just restricted to North Korea. If you're researching any authoritarian country, these are the kinds of obstacles that you're going to come up against, which means you have to triangulate your data with a number of different sources to try and not just human sources, but other forms of intelligence and other forms of documentary evidence, and try and piece it together as a jigsaw puzzle, which is what makes researching North Korea both really difficult, but also really interesting, because there's a lot of problem solving that goes with that. So when you visit, what you're left with is what you can glean from direct observation. So this is what this photo illustrates here. This is a couple of my field note journals from my 2012 and 2013 trips, full of these handwritten notes that I've cobbled together during those visits based on what I've seen. So how do you do it? What's your methodology for collecting data in country? Well, here I'm inspired by the British geographer Peter Atkins, who wrote a couple of really great articles in the late 1990s arguing that politics, economy, ideology and culture are coded into North Korea's landscapes. And you've heard me sort of move in this direction as I've been explaining the tour experience, that ideology, all of these things are coded into what you see. Through landscapes, we can also see the influence of human economies and human power structures over the ways in which different people interact with and are allowed to access the resources of that landscape. So there's two important questions that are front of mind when I'm drawing on direct observation as a research method when I'm on tour. So one, what's in the landscape, both geographical and ecological features, as well as human-influenced environments? And second, who are the people in the landscape and how are they relating to it? With these two questions in mind, that's where all these notes come from. That's how I'm trying to interpret what I'm seeing while I'm in country. So keep these two questions in mind because we're going to draw on these observation skills in our class activity, in which we'll go on a virtual tour of North Korea using Google Earth. But let's have a go at this landscape reading thing now. This picture here shows a farm village north of Kaesong. So I took this picture in 2012. Now what we see in this picture is a set of stories. It's a set of stories of intersecting sets of relationships. There's an interlocking dance of geography and environment and human networks going on here, which if you know what you're looking for, you can start to decode. So for one, there's a story in the soil. Now the soil's telling us that there's poor soil fertility, which tells us about the food import dependency of the country, because poor soil fertility is a product of essentially the country strip mining all the nutrients from the soil and not being able to produce enough fertilizer or organic material to put back into soil to make it more fertile. So this is this is a real local manifestation of the broader food insecurity problem and the interface between local nutrient cycles and broader national food security. There's the story of the crops that you see here. So what you're seeing is a monocrop. They're only growing one thing in a given space. You're also seeing that all of the available land is tilled around these apartment buildings. So there's no land wasted. And again, that's a food insecurity issue. You don't piss away land on rose gardens or anything that's pretty. You use all of the available soil to grow food because your survival depends on it. Then the road tells a story. So like I said earlier, most of the roads in North Korea, particularly between towns, are unpaved and they're vulnerable to rains and floods. So even though they're the primary network of linkage for moving goods and people around, they're extremely unreliable when there's any kind of extreme weather events, which there are every summer. And that contributes to the food insecurity problem as well, because it's difficult to transport food from farm to consumers. Then there's the story of the houses in the picture. So we see there's power lines there. So these houses are electrified. They're multi-story and they're relatively new. This area is also in close proximity to the DMZ. So this tells us about North Korea's Songbun class system. To live in a sensitive area like this with relatively good housing in proximity to the border means that these people are considered politically reliable. They've earned the right to live in a location like this. Finally, there's the story of the people in this slide. Now, there's a few in there that you can see if you look hard. And what you notice when you drive through the countryside in North Korea is that there's lots of people around. And like when you drive through the country in Australia, there's hardly any people around because agriculture is broadacre, it's mechanized, farm labour is done by machines, so it doesn't require many people. Whereas in North Korea, agricultural labour is demechanized because there's no fuel, which means it's all done by humans and beasts of burden, which means there's always lots of people walking around along the roads or in the fields or whatever. It's all manual labour. They're all moving slowly because it's hard work and they don't want to wear themselves out. And the people in the countryside are visibly skinnier and more ragged than the city residents. So that tells us, one, that the lifestyle's harder than it is for people in the city, and there's not as many amenities available. So even though this is a relatively privileged location, it's still not as good as living in Pyongyang. Living in Pyongyang is the dream for anyone in North Korea. So overall, this is a completely human-mediated landscape. So this shows the anthropocentric worldview of North Korean ideology, which is all about reshaping nature in the visage of the revolution. And this is the microcosm of the systems of political and economic control in North Korea. It's all about control, whether of people or of landscapes. So that gives you a brief introduction about the kind of process that I go through when I'm trying to interpret what I see when I'm in country in North Korea, or in any other field research context for that matter. This is a really great skill to pick up.